A young college-aged man goes out with his friends one night and he drinks. Not so much you'd expect much of a problem, but enough to call into question his actions. And on that night, he ends up taking a walk alone or leaving the bar or otherwise being separated from the group. And that's the last time he's ever seen alive. His body shows up weeks later in a river, and there are suspicious circumstances surrounding his death and his body. But after some investigation, the police department slams the case shut and rules his death an accidental drowning. He had too much to drink, he slipped into the river, and he drowned. It's tragic, but simple. The thing is, his friends and family believe otherwise. He was young, intelligent, popular, athletically gifted. He was responsible, and he's not the kind of guy who'd wander off alone, slip into a river, and die. Plus, it seems the police departments aren't looking into any other possible causes of death, despite controversial findings in the autopsy, and it frustrates the families. They want answers and justice, but they feel ignored and shoved aside. The story I just told you fits the profile almost to a T of over 40 different deaths across 25 different cities and 11 different states, and it's the crux of the Smiley Face Killers theory, which is what we will be diving into today. It's a controversial theory and has people landing on one of two sides. Either the deaths of these men are completely accidental and the Smiley Face Killers theory is taking away necessary attention from the real cause of these deaths and thus taking away attention from possible solutions. Or these are not coincidental deaths, but rather there is some string, some connection between all of these deaths that we have yet to figure out, and that we are on the tail of potentially one of the most dangerous criminal syndicates in the United States. In this video, I not only want to discuss the Smiley Face Killers, but I want to question whether the Smiley Face Killers are the same as the Dealers of Death, a mysterious gang that was associated with the Smiley Face Killers back in 2008, but seemingly have disappeared from online chatter since then. And before we dive in, real quick, I want to do an intro. My name is Carolyn. I cover all things true crime, cold cases, cults, conspiracies, creepy history, anything that takes your mind down a dark yet intellectual little trip. I'd appreciate a subscribe, comment, like, whatever. But if not, that's okay. I'm just glad you're here. So with that, let's dive in.
Fell into the river on his way home. Although there's water in his lungs, there's not a significant amount that we usually see in drowning victims.
Police never led us to believe that foul play took place at all.
The Smiley Face Killer theory really began in 1997 when a young man named Patrick McNeil went mysteriously missing and was then found dead almost 2 months later in the water near a pier in the Bay Ridge area of Brooklyn, New York. His death kickstarted an investigation that led to the discovery of a high number of college-aged, usually white, smart, and athletically gifted men disappearing on nights out and then showing up dead weeks later in bodies of water. As investigators dug deeper, they noticed some chilling, repetitive patterns, not only between the deaths, but also where the bodies were found. In many of the cases, next to where these bodies were found, someone had graffitied a smiley face. And while the smiley face is one of the most common symbols known by the public, the detectives behind the Smiley Face Killers theory have announced that there are 12 different symbols or words that keep showing up over and over again at these recovery sites. Now, they haven't released these symbols for fear of copycat killers or messing with their investigation, but after some online sleuthing, I know that one of them is the word Sinsinawa, which is an unincorporated town in Wisconsin along the border of Iowa and Illinois, and also means rattlesnake or home of the young eagle. So do with that what you will, but I just wanted that information out there. Now, the Smiley Face Killers theory has been going on for almost 2 decades now, and as additional information has been gathered and as times have changed, the theory itself has morphed to fit with the times. But before we get too far into discussing what the theory is in present day, let's first rewind and start this discussion where the theory first began, in 1997. Patrick was a Fordham University student and was described as good-looking, clean-cut, athletic, a ladies' man, and was on the right path towards his dream, which was to work for the FBI. But his plans were derailed on February 17th of 1997, when he went missing in New York City during a late night out with his friends. He was last seen at Dapper Dog, a bar on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and the state he was in was not a good one. Witnesses reported seeing him throwing up in the bathroom shortly before he left the bar, and then once outside the bar, additional witnesses reported that he was highly unstable and disoriented. He was quite drunk, so maybe that was it, but witnesses said it was just too much. He He was not just drunk, it seemed like something else was making him sick. He was stumbling around, falling against parked cars, and continually vomiting. He started walking, or probably more accurately stumbling, south down 2nd Avenue, and onlookers reported seeing a double parked car sitting right outside the bar, with a man and a woman in it, slowly following him down the street. When Patrick fell on the ground, the car following him stopped, and then when he got back up and began walking again, the car continued to follow him. Observers said Patrick turned left onto 90th Street heading the direction of the East River, and the car turned with him, right on his tail. And that was the last time he was seen alive. His friends and family launched a huge campaign trying to find him, putting flyers out, searching everywhere, doing everything they could to find him. But for almost 2 months they came up empty-handed, until April 7th, when his body was found floating face up in the water near a pier in the Bay Ridge area of Brooklyn. The police were pretty quick to rule it as a drowning, with the manner of death being undetermined, but his family did not buy it. And actually, members of the police force themselves, they also didn't buy it. More specifically, a man named Kevin Gannon strongly disagreed with the idea that it was an accidental drowning or a drowning at all, and he vowed to Patrick's parents that he would discover the true manner of Patrick's death. The thing is, this was an uphill battle from the beginning. While Patrick's body was recovered in 1997, the year he disappeared, the medical examiner's office didn't provide the McNeil family with a complete package of his records, which included his autopsy report, photographs, and other things, until 11 years later, in 2008. But Gannon was committed to his vow and his belief that this was not a simple case of a drunk college kid falling into a river and drowning. After he retired from the NYPD in 2001, he enlisted Anthony Duarte, his old partner, and they created a company called Nationwide Investigation, which is now known as Global Death Investigations, and set out to learn what actually happened to Patrick. And Gannon and Duarte are not unaccomplished random former police officers. They are impressive people. Gannon is a 20-year veteran of the New York City Police Department. He has over 1,000 felony apprehensions. He was awarded almost 100 medals for bravery, and when he retired, he was the most highly decorated officer in NYPD history. Duarte was a 21-year veteran in law enforcement. He's well experienced in organized crime. He's an expert in state-of-the-art computer technology for data research, and he worked in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. They eventually joined forces with a man named Dr. Lee Gilbertson, who has a Master of Science in Criminal Justice, spent 16 years in the military, is a professor at St. Cloud State University, has studied gangs, militia, and extremist groups since 1996, and is a gang specialist. So, these guys are stacked with experience and knowledge. Convinced that Patrick's case was mishandled and the investigators were completely wrong, they reviewed Patrick's autopsy, his photos, the report, and everything you could to see what they were working with. And what they found was astounding. In Nationwide Investigation's report, they break down why they believe Patrick was murdered. And I read it, so I'll take you guys through some of the most damning evidence in support of the argument that it was a homicide. First, the recovery location was 12 miles away from where he was last seen alive, and given the information obtained about the water currents in the East River and the NYPD harbor unit that patrols the river every day, his body should not have been recovered where it was. As a result, they concluded that his body was deposited there by a third party. He did not die in the water and just drift to that location. Second, one of the witnesses who reported having seen the car stalk Patrick had given the police a partial plate number to further investigate. And guess what? The missing person's supervisor refused to pay for a search of all the possible number letter combinations because it was just too expensive. How expensive, you might ask? Well, it was $1,200. Apparently, way too expensive to potentially save someone's life or apprehend a murderer. Third, Patrick's blood alcohol concentration was 0.16. Now, human bodies naturally produce alcohol after death as part of decomp. So, if we're taking into consideration that he was allegedly in the water for almost 2 months, his BAC should have increased by 0.04 due to post-mortem alcohol production. Meaning, his actual BAC upon entering the water and allegedly drowning was more around 0.12, which is equivalent to 6 drinks. Now, Patrick was a college-aged, 6-foot-tall, 195-pound man who was probably not new to drinking. Given all of this information, Gannon and Duarte concluded that if this was his true BAC upon leaving the bar, there was no way it was alcohol that was making him vomit repeatedly, stumble around, fall against cars, and also fall onto the ground. There must have been something else that made Patrick sick that night. Fourth, the fact that Patrick's body was found face up in the water was already very suspicious because drowning victims are usually face down. But on top of this, according to photographs taken, Gannon pointed out that the blood had not pooled nor settled along his back post-mortem, which is what you would expect if he had been floating in the river face up for almost 2 months. This is suspicious and supports the theory that he did not actually die face up in the water. Another absolutely crazy thing that Emmy barely paid attention to is that there were ligature marks on Patrick's neck. The Emmy noted a pattern of numerous vertical lines evenly spaced around his neck in a pattern as if to, in the Emmy's written words, his own words, suggest some type of binding. Yet it was still not ruled a homicide. And the last big point of controversy that I'm going to bring up is the fact that fly eggs were found in Patrick's body. And those fly eggs were in a state of arrested development, so they never developed. The thing is, flies do not lay eggs on a deceased person's body in temperatures under 50 degrees. If Patrick had died in the middle of the night in February and was floating in a cold river, these flies would not have laid eggs on him. And Gannon conferred with a slew of experts to make sure he was correct on this point, and every expert agreed that the flies should not have been able to lay eggs on a decedent who was outdoors at night in temperatures under 50 degrees. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist, specifically said, "I'm saying that the fly larvae have been laid in the groin area. It's an indoor fly. Could not have been an outdoor fly. It was an indoor fly. And the larvae were there, did not move ahead into the later stage. So we have a body that was already dead before it was placed in the water. I would call it homicide, yes." With all of this, Gannon concluded from his own investigation that this was not an accidental drowning, that Patrick was stalked, potentially drugged with GHB, abducted, held for an extended period of time, killed, and then disposed of in the river. Now, while investigating Patrick's death, Gannon and Dwart began looking at similar cases to see if there was some kind of connection. And boy, did they find a connection. They found 40 similar deaths of similar men, and at many of the crime scenes they found a smiley face being graffitied on the wall or on a tree or somewhere nearby. And from this discovery came the Smiley Face Killer theory. But because of adding Dr. Gilbertson to the team, the theory expanded from a single serial killer to something larger, something more sinister. He believes it's a network of individuals, essentially a gang of cell-based activity spread across different states and cities, and the smiley face, or one of the other 12 different symbols, are used to swear allegiance to one another, a sign of loyalty or belonging to this group. And this fits with the fact that these men kept showing up under similar suspicious circumstances in different cities across the US, that there was enough commonality between these cases to raise a red flag, but they were different enough that an individual serial killer couldn't be responsible for every single one of these deaths. And like I said, these cases really just kept cropping up. One of the very memorable ones occurred in 2002, when a boy named Christopher Jenkins had been bar hopping with friends for Halloween while dressed as a Native American. Well, at one of the bars, he allegedly became too intoxicated and was asked to leave. Despite being visibly irritated by this request, he left to take a cooling-off walk, leaving his jacket, wallet, and mobile phone behind. The bouncer reported seeing him exit the bar and turn left, and that was the last time he was seen alive. When Chris didn't return home, his friends and family were understandably worried and got the police involved. On 2 separate occasions, bloodhounds picked up his scent in front of a pizza joint, and they followed his scent into a parking garage and to the same exact parking stall. In addition, blood drops and a red feather, possibly from his costume, were later found. Now, this pizza joint was a point of interest because the night Chris went missing, it was reported that a group of at least 10 men attacked someone in a gang initiation right outside that very pizza shop, and it was around the same time Chris had left the bar. But no one knew much about the attack, the gang, or the victim, so it became a cold lead. 4 months after Chris disappeared, his body was found in Hennepin River. He was on his back, his arms and legs were crossed, he was still wearing his completely intact Halloween costume, with his shirt tucked into its drawstring pants. He had on his slip-on shoes, a necklace, 2 rings, and clumps of his own hair were found in his closed fists. Despite the autopsy finding signs of a struggle, the case was initially closed with authorities saying it was an accidental drowning. And like these other cases, the parents fought back very hard, adamantly disagreeing with the conclusion that he had just wandered off on Halloween night, fell into a river, drowned, and then died with his body laying floating in the river for 4 months straight. But unlike many of the other cases, they successfully got Jenkins' manner of death reclassified as a homicide. Now, this acted as affirmation to Gannon and his team that they were on the right track, that the authorities were misclassifying these deaths and overlooking substantial evidence. But if Gannon kept digging, he would find an answer to his questions. So Gannon and his team kept searching, and the more they looked, the more they found. Time after time, young men were disappearing for extended periods of time, and then showing up dead in bodies of water or rivers surrounded by mysterious circumstances. In April of 2004, Jared Dion's body was found in the Mississippi River in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where he allegedly drowned after spending the evening drinking with buddies. His baseball cap was found perched on a post next to the river. He was the 7th young man since 1997 to drown in the Mississippi River off the shores of La Crosse. Then, in March of 2006, Matt Krzyzewski disappeared after being thrown out of a strip club and was found later in the Mississippi River. Authorities said he drowned, despite his blood alcohol concentration only being 0.09. Interestingly enough, Matt and Jared Dion were wrestling teammates at Heartland Arrowhead High School. Now, that same year, in September, Lucas Homan's body was found in the Mississippi River after a night out celebrating Oktoberfest. And as we'd expect at this point, authorities ruled the death an accidental drowning, despite wounds and abrasions found all over Luke's body. Marty Ludis, a forensic footwear specialist, believes Luke's forehead injury is a mark made by the sole of a boot, and the scratches near the top of his forehead may have been caused by stones stuck between the treads of the boot. And Bobby Chagan, an underwater forensic expert, pointed out that the injuries to the outer side of Luke's hands and head look like they were sustained in a fight. If the injuries were post-mortem travel abrasions, the patterns would be similar, but the wounds would not be as red as Luke's markings. Post-mortem wounds are usually white or have no color at all, and this is because the body doesn't send blood to the wound after death. Nonetheless, authorities are staunch in their belief that all those injuries were sustained while the body was moving through the water, and they still have not reopened the case. We also have Jeff Geezy, who was found dead with GHB in his body, the date rape drug. Nathan Kapfer, also found dead with his belongings stacked neatly near a Native American statue. Josh Snell, also found dead, and who, right before his disappearance, made a phone call saying he was being chased. And then 2 of his shirts were found on the riverbank. As the list kept growing, it fueled Gannon and his team to keep looking. And around 2008, they thought they caught a break, because as the Milwaukee Magazine was doing research into Matt Krzyzewski's death, they came across some chilling information. A gang called the Dealers of Death claimed involvement in the deaths of all of these young men, including Matt Krzyzewski. See, a man named Jeremy Alford, a convicted murderer and who at the time was also a suspect in another river death, told the FBI in 2007 that his gang, the Dealers of Death, murdered 40 different men. Interestingly enough, the FBI said there's no evidence the gang exists, but they did admit that Alford discussed the gang, and local cops verified that the gang did in fact exist, and they had run across it repeatedly. A detective, Gary Sykes, of the New Brighton Police Department, is convinced that the Dealers of Death is a gang that robs people for drug money, mainly in Minneapolis. He believes that they have no compassion for human life, making them capable of almost anything. Now, Alford was from rural Iowa, near Cedar Rapids, and him and his brother, who has also been convicted of murder, lived in Minneapolis and would shuttle between Minnesota and Iowa. Alford was described as one of those guys who couldn't keep out of the way of the police, and in 2005, he was arrested for harboring runaways. He would tell these runaways he would take them to Minnesota and make them part of his gang, which he claimed was a political subdivision of a Chicago gang. He even branded one of these fugitives using a hot razor to create the beginnings of a 5-point star. Then, in 2007, Alford was convicted of brutally murdering a man, and according to the prosecutor, he tried to falsely blame the homicide on fellow gang members from the Dealers of Death. Specifically, he blamed 2 different members nicknamed Smiley and Roach. Investigators interrogated these men, and according to them, the Dealers of Death had 300 members, and the leader was Alford. In one of the interrogations, Smiley mentioned that Alford had once bragged about murdering a college student in a Native American costume by throwing the kid over a bridge. Obviously, this confession caught people's attention. Did Alfred kill Chris Jenkins? Investigators looked closer, and according to the man who prosecuted Alfred for another crime, Alfred once had a jail visit with a relative and apparently spent his entire 15 minutes discussing a possible alibi for Halloween in 2002, which was the night Chris disappeared. And on that night, Alfred was allegedly supposed to be spending it with his sister, but according to his sister, he never showed up. The thing is, though, this all led to a dead end, because I have not found much information on the dealers of death past 2008. The FBI says that Alfred is not credible, and other people have said that he liked to brag and lie, exaggerate, take credit for things that he didn't do. In addition, there is a major hole in Alfred's alleged confession. There is only one bridge he could have thrown Chris Jenkins off of, the Hennepin Avenue Bridge. That bridge has steel beams and suspension cables that would have made throwing someone off the bridge without injuring them almost impossible. The assailant would have had to lift a grown man over a high safety rail and then throw him 4 to 5 feet out over the support beam to avoid the vertical cables. On top of this, surveillance footage shows Chris never even walked across the bridge. So that leads us to wonder, is the gang dealers of death even real? Was it involved in the deaths of these young men? Or are we just picking up random pieces and desperately trying to force them to fit together? Now, despite this slight diversion, nationwide investigations continued to support the theory of the Smiley Face Killers, convinced it was the answer to all, or at least most, of these deaths. But as we'd expect, they experienced significant pushback. In 2008, the FBI entered the fray and said, over the past several years, law enforcement and the FBI have received information about young, college-aged men who were found deceased in rivers in the Midwest. The FBI has reviewed the information about the victims provided by 2 retired police detectives, who have dubbed these incidents the Smiley Face Murders, and interviewed an individual who provided information to the detectives. To date, we've not developed any evidence to support links between these tragic deaths or any evidence substantiating the theory that these deaths are the work of a serial killer or killers. The vast majority of these instances appear to be alcohol-related drownings. The FBI will continue to work with the local police in the affected areas to provide support as requested. Then, in 2010, the Center for Homicide Research came out with a scathing 12-page report debunking the Smiley Face Killers theory and blaming this belief on observational bias, groupthink, and a lack of critical thought. Among other things, they said that graffiti is omnipresent and that smiley faces are universal symbols of happiness that are used everywhere, that graffitiing smiley faces on public or private property is simply an action done by vandals taunting the police. They also said that homicidal drownings are extremely rare, only accounting for 0.2% of all US killings, except rebuttal. A big argument here is that these men were not killed via drowning. They were killed on land and then deposited into water, but okay, Center for Homicide Research. They also said that confessions by inmates are unreliable, which, fair, but that confession was already debunked, so it's not really relevant. And then they also said that none of the smiley faces matched, so it could not have been done by a serial killer. They were obviously done by different people, all just vandals. But okay, Center for Homicide Research, the theory is that it's a gang of people. So again, your argument kinda misses the entire point of the theory. So, as you can tell, there was mounting opposition against Gannon and his team, but nonetheless, they were convinced they were on the right track. And then, in 2017, another young man named Dakota James was found dead, floating in the Ohio River 40 days after he disappeared after, you guessed it, a night out with his friends. Authorities labeled it an accidental drowning, which, classic. But here's the thing, he was swim team captain. His parents, understandably, said absolutely not. Foul play must have been involved. And his autopsy supported their argument because it showed he had ligature marks on the back of his neck, and there was discoloration in his fingernails that appeared consistent with someone trying to escape strangulation. So, of course, Gannon and his team added this to their growing list of victims of the Smiley Face Killers. And on top of that, the story around this man's disappearance was very suspicious, to say the least. Weeks before his disappearance, he called a friend, and when she picked up, Dakota was frantic, sobbing, disoriented, and said he had just lost a solid 4 hours of time. He asked her to pick him up, and when she arrived to get him, she saw Dakota walking towards a strange SUV, acting as if he was about to get in. According to her, the only reason he didn't get in was because she showed up. And then, an even more chilling aspect of this case came out. 2 days after Dakota disappeared, his PayPal account was used, making everyone wonder if Dakota was dead in a river, who was using his account. So obviously, Gannon and his team were on this case and strongly believe that the Smiley Face Killers are the culprits in what they and Dakota's parents believe was a homicide. Then in 2019, the Smiley Face Killers theory gained additional support and momentum when Oxygen produced a TV series called Smiley Face Killers: The Hunt for Justice, which was a 6-part docuseries diving into the theory and various cases of potential victims. See, over time, Gannon and his team had further refined their theory. They now argued there are 350 victims of the Smiley Face Killers, and that it is the most dangerous domestic terrorist group in the United States. That it has small cells in major cities, keeps contact through the dark web, hides under the cover of accidental deaths, uses GHB to incapacitate their victims, kills them, and then deposits their bodies in rivers or lakes. And then, in a shocking twist of events, they were given further support for their theory. They were provided a URL that took them to a dark web portal and apparently linked them to the Smiley Face Killers and their online network. The issue was, in order to log in, they needed a password and to enable their web camera. And not only did they not have the password, they were not about to enable their web camera on the dark web. But despite being unable to get inside the portal, they still found this as further evidence that a criminal enterprise was working via the dark web, connecting serial killers across states that targeted college-aged men. And so, to this day, Gannon and his associates work through global death investigations in an effort to vindicate the victims of the Smiley Face Killers. And also to this day, the world is split into 2 different camps. We have those that see this as independent, individual, tragic accidents, where young men get drunk, make a mistake, and wind up drowning. And I mean, that makes some sense, right? The similarities are not because some third party is hunting these men down, but rather because these kinds of deaths are relatively common, and we might expect them to all look similar. They see the smiley faces as nothing more than generic graffiti, done by different vandals in an attempt to taunt the police by defacing public property. But nothing past that. They argue that by fueling the Smiley Face Killers theory, we are taking time and attention from real solutions for risky situations that are hurting young men across the United States. But on the other side, we have people, including experts, arguing that there are too many similarities for this to be a coincidence, that these men are young, smart, and athletic, that they aren't the kind of men to fall prey to an unfortunate accident, over and over and over again. We have delayed decomposition, bodies not looking like they were drowned, articles of clothing either weirdly missing, stacking up on the shore somewhere safely, or completely intact on the decedent's body. Some of these men have GHB in their systems, and others have autopsy reports that definitely point towards potential foul play. They argue that since there is a lack of evidence of these bodies actually floating in rivers for the length of time they were missing, then the smiley faces and other symbols showing up at the recovery sites are not random, but instead intentionally placed. And involved in all of this are the grieving families who want answers for the deaths of their sons and brothers, who also disagree over what happened to their loved ones, with some supporting Gannon and his team and others apprehensive about the entire setup. Now, as for me, I can't ignore the similarities of this case, and I especially can't ignore the fact that authorities continue to rule them as accidental drownings, despite obviously contrary evidence. And then organizations like the Center for Homicide Research using stats on the lack of homicidal drownings to support the argument that these are not homicidal drownings. Buddy, if we keep seeing medical examiners ignoring ligature marks on necks, among many other things, and ruling those deaths as accidental drownings, then of course we are going to have a small number of homicidal drownings, right? It's a bit of a circular argument, isn't it? And beyond that, Gannon and his team aren't even arguing these men are being drowned. They're arguing their already dead bodies are being deposited in the rivers. I feel like half of the arguments I've read against the theory attack points that are not even being made. So, Center for Homicide Research, you say supporters of this theory are involved in cognitive bias, but I'm going to respond and say you're using a logical fallacy, specifically the straw man argument, to debunk the Smiley Face Killers theory. And I'm not saying that those who disagree with the theory are totally in the wrong. Yes, drunk men wander off alone and engage in risky behaviors often, and definitely yes, the idea that these deaths are all associated with smiley face graffiti is a bit of a stretch, especially when you add 12 other symbols or words. At that point, you could pick the top 12 most commonly used graffiti marks, and I'm sure you would find at least one of them at every recovery site. But I think focusing on the graffiti is somewhat of a waste of time. Maybe a red herring. We have enough evidence between all the deaths to support some kind of connection, even if not every single one of those men were victims of the Smiley Face Killers. See, I think we need to revisit the Dealers of Death situation. Am I arguing that Alfred, the alleged leader of the Dealers of Death, killed Chris Jenkins by throwing him over a bridge? No. I think Alfred is uncredible and a liar, and evidence does not support the theory that Chris was thrown off a bridge. But it seems we have enough support for the existence of a gang called the Dealers of Death to believe that they do, in fact, exist. Maybe Alfred was part of it at one point, or maybe him and his associates were aware of it, they latched on, and they were simply copycat killers, desperate to seem a part of a secret criminal network that's been operating for decades under the noses of law enforcement. To be honest, the fact that Gannon and his team believe this is a dark web criminal syndicate, and I can't find anything on the Dealers of Death past the year of 2008, makes me further believe that the Dealers of Death are somehow involved. Don't you think people on the dark web would have the ability to erase traces of their gang online? But on the flip side, maybe I can't find anything past 2008 because they truly are a dead end, and they either never existed or they have since gone out of business, if that's what gangs do. I can really argue either side on this case, and either way, I see evidence stacking up on both sides of this debate, in support of the Smiley Face Killers theory, but also in opposition of it. At this point, I think I've given you guys enough information for you to decide for yourselves. So, I ask, what do you think? Does the theory have any merit? Or are these simply independent and tragic accidents? And if you have an alternative theory, please share it. Or if you have thoughts on my theory, let me know. I would love to talk to you about it. And then with all of that, that is the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you all stay safe and stay curious. Have a great week, or weekend, or both.